Emma had ignored the signs for too long. The late nights, the whispered phone calls, the way Daniel always kept his phone face down on the table. She told herself it was stress, that his long hours at the office were normal, that their relationship was just going through a rough patch. But the truth had been staring her in the face all along. That night she had not planned to go through his phone. She was not that kind of person, but when Daniel stepped out of the shower, carelessly leaving his phone on the nightstand, it vibrated once, twice, then again. Her heart hammered as she glanced at the screen. A message: "Can't wait to see you again. Last night was amazing." A picture followed, a woman in red lingerie draped across satin sheets. Hannah. Emma's stomach twisted violently. She knew Hannah, one of Daniel's colleagues, the one he swore was just a friend. She did not realize she had picked up the phone until she heard herself say, "How long?" Daniel, rubbing a towel over his hair, turned to her lazily. "What?" She lifted the phone. "How long have you been sleeping with her?" A brief flicker of something annoyance crossed his face before he let out a short laugh. "Jesus, Emma, you are going through my phone now. That is what you are upset about?" Her voice shook. "Not the fact that you have been cheating." Daniel sighed, walking past her as if she were an inconvenience rather than the woman he had spent the last 3 years with. "You are being dramatic." She gaped at him. "Dramatic? I just saw a picture of her in your bed." And he turned, arms crossed, looking at her like she was a child throwing a tantrum. "What did you expect, Emma?" She felt like the air had been knocked from her lungs. "I expected you to love me." Daniel rolled his eyes. "Love, Emma? You have not exactly been exciting lately. You whine, you complain, you expect me to entertain you." "I have been loyal to you," she shouted. "And I have provided for you." His voice was dangerously calm. "Who pays the rent, who buys the groceries, who makes sure you have a nice life?" He took a slow step toward her. "You think you are owed something just because you love me?" Emma backed up, her hands trembling. This was not the man she had fallen in love with, or maybe it was, and she had just been too blind to see it. Daniel sighed, rubbing his temple like she was the problem. "Look, I do not want to fight. You should just accept it." She stared at him in disbelief. "You expect me to just let you cheat?" He shrugged. "It is not cheating if it does not mean anything." Emma's vision blurred with unshed tears. "You are disgusting." And then, for the first time, Daniel's expression shifted. Annoyance gave way to something colder, darker. Before she could react, his hand lashed out. The slap came so fast that for a second she did not register the pain. Her head snapped to the side, a sharp sting blooming across her cheek. Silence swallowed the room. Emma brought a hand to her face, stunned. Daniel exhaled, shaking his head. "See what you made me do." Her pulse pounded in her ears. He had hit her. He had actually hit her. She staggered back and he grabbed her wrist before she could escape. "Sit down," he ordered. Emma shook her head. "Let go of me." "You are going to apologize." His grip tightened to Hannah. The words sent a fresh wave of nausea rolling through her. "Are you insane?" Daniel yanked her closer, his breath hot against her ear. "You embarrassed me, Emma. You acted like a jealous brat. You are going to call Hannah and tell her you overreacted." Tears slipped down her face. "I will not." His fingers dug into her wrist hard enough to bruise. "You will." Her body was frozen in fear, and before she could think, before she could even process what was happening, she found herself dialing. The phone rang once, twice, then Hannah's voice, smooth and smug. "Daniel." Emma swallowed back a sob. "No, it is Emma." A pause, then a knowing hum. "I wanted to say I am sorry." The words felt like shards of glass in her throat. "I overreacted." Daniel nodded approvingly, releasing her wrist. Hannah chuckled. "Of course you did." The call ended. Daniel kissed the top of Emma's head like he had done 1,000 times before. "Good girl." She did not sleep that night. Her cheek throbbed, but it was nothing compared to the ache in her chest. She had spent years building a life with this man, and now she could not even recognize him. As the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, she reached for her phone. She did not call the police. She did not call her best friend. She called her mother. The phone barely rang before Margaret picked up Emma. Emma's voice broke. "I need help." Margaret did not hesitate. "Come home." Emma stuffed a few belongings into a bag, her hands shaking. She had no plan, no money. Daniel had made sure of that, but she had something stronger. A way out. Margaret wasted no time. The moment Emma walked through the front door of her childhood home, her mother took one look at her face and inhaled sharply. You look awful, she muttered, but there was something in her eyes that Emma had never seen before, concern, maybe even guilt. Margaret set down her coffee, gesturing for Emma to sit. I assume this has to do with that useless boyfriend of yours. Emma nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Margaret sighed. I told you men like him only take. Emma let out a shaky breath. I know. Margaret studied her for a long moment, then leaned back in her chair. I have a solution. Emma frowned. Mom, I do not need a solution, I just need time. You do not have time. Her mother's voice was matter of fact. You have no job, no savings. What are you going to do? Start over? Emma hesitated. Margaret sipped her coffee. There is a man, Henry Carter. Emma blinked. Excuse me. He is looking for a wife. It is not romantic, it is practical. Emma gaped at her. You want me to marry a stranger? Margaret shrugged. Not a stranger, a successful man, a man who will not hit you, a man who can give you security. Emma wanted to argue, to say that she did not need saving. But she was exhausted, broken, and worst of all, she had nowhere else to go. She exhaled shakily. Tell me about him. Margaret smiled. Now you are thinking sensibly. Emma sat across from Henry Carter, studying the man her mother had chosen for her. He was nothing like Daniel. Where Daniel was sleek and charming, Henry was composed and distant. He wore a crisp suit, his dark hair neatly styled, and his blue eyes sharp with calculation. There was no warmth in his gaze, only assessment. You understand what this arrangement means, he said calmly, his voice low and measured. Emma swallowed. Yes. Henry tapped his fingers against the table as if considering his next words. This is not about love, this is about security. I need a wife to maintain appearances. You need stability. It is a transaction. Emma clenched her hands in her lap. The words stung, but they were honest, more honest than anything Daniel had ever said to her. What are your expectations? Henry studied her. I do not expect affection, I do not expect devotion, I expect loyalty. You will be provided for, you will have your own space. I will not interfere in your life so long as you do not interfere in mine. Emma hesitated. Something about his cold logic was oddly reassuring after the storm of emotions she had just escaped, and in return. He looked her directly in the eyes. In return you will be Mrs. Carter, and you will never have to worry about survival again. She had spent years trying to make Daniel love her. She had spent years believing in romance, and it had left her with nothing. Maybe love was not the answer, maybe this was. She lifted her chin. I accept. The wedding was a quiet affair. There were no flowers, no romantic vows, no celebration. Henry handled everything efficiently, with the precision of a man closing a business deal. He signed the papers, she signed them too, and just like that she became Mrs. Emma Carter. Margaret beamed with approval. This is the best decision you have ever made, Emma. You will never regret it. Emma nodded, but something inside her felt hollow. The house was enormous, a modern mansion with high ceilings and cold marble floors. It did not feel like a home, it felt like a museum. Henry showed her to her room. It was spacious, with a large bed and a window overlooking the city skyline. This is your space, he said. You may decorate it as you wish. I will not intrude. Emma hesitated before speaking. Do you have any rules? Only one, Henry said firmly. Do not lie to me. She met his gaze, and for the first time in years she felt something she had not expected: safety. Weeks passed. Emma adjusted to her new life. Henry was distant but never unkind. He was predictable, structured. His world ran on schedules and logic. She learned his habits, his routines. He always had breakfast at exactly 7. He worked late into the night. His conversations were brief but never dismissive. She had never felt so alone and yet so free. Then one evening she found herself standing outside his study, the door slightly ajar. She had not meant to eavesdrop, but his voice stopped her cold. I have no interest in love, he was saying. I simply need to keep up appearances. That is all she is for. Emma's stomach twisted. She had known this was a transaction, but hearing it aloud still hurt. She stepped back, her chest tight, but as she turned away she caught sight of something on his desk, a file with her name on it. Her pulse quickened. Why did he have a file on her? Emma hesitated, then stepped inside. She flipped it open, and what she saw made her blood run cold. Inside were records of her past, her relationship with Daniel, details she had never shared with Henry. It was as if he had been watching her long before they met. There were even documents about Daniel and Hannah, photos, evidence Henry had been tracking them. Her hands trembled as she shut the file. What kind of man had she married? That night Emma could not sleep, her mind raced with questions. Was Henry dangerous? Was she just a pawn in some larger plan? The next morning she confronted him. She placed the file on the dining table, her heart pounding. What is this? Henry did not look surprised. He set down his coffee calmly. I like to be informed. You investigated me before we even met. That is not normal. He tilted his head slightly. What is normal? Emma, trusting a man who cheats on you, accepting violence as part of love. Emma's breath caught in her throat. Henry leaned back in his chair. I knew what kind of man Daniel was before you did. I knew you would leave him eventually, and I knew when you did you would need an option. Her stomach twisted. You planned this. You knew my mother would push me toward you. He nodded. I gave her a solution before you even knew you needed one. Emma felt sick. It was like she had been walking in a carefully constructed maze, one Henry had built for her. She wanted to be furious, but the truth was she felt something else: gratitude, because despite the manipulation, despite the cold logic, Henry had saved her in a way no one else had. She exhaled sharply. And what happens now? Henry studied her for a long moment. Now we continue. You have security. I have my wife. Nothing has changed. Emma stared at him. She should have felt trapped. She should have been terrified. But for the first time in years she felt powerful, because now she knew something she had never understood before. Henry Carter did not want love, but he did want control. And she had just become the only person who could shake it. Emma had always believed power belonged to those who demanded it, who raised their voices, who took up space. Henry had taught her something else. True power was quiet. It was knowing more than the other person, knowing when to strike, when to wait, when to let them think they were in control. She did not confront Henry again after that night. Instead, she watched, she learned, she let him believe she had accepted her role as his wife, but she paid attention to the way he operated, how his employees responded to him, how his presence commanded silence in a room. She noticed how his business partners spoke in cautious tones, how even the most powerful men never dared to challenge him. She was married to a man who did not just demand control, he expected it, and yet she was the only person in his life who did not fear him. That was something she could use. One evening at a charity gala, Emma played the perfect role, the poised wife, the elegant partner on Henry's arm, but as he discussed business with an associate she caught a glimpse of a familiar face across the room. Daniel. Her pulse spiked. He was smirking, drink in hand, his arm draped over Hannah's shoulder. They looked every bit the smug, untouchable couple. Then Daniel's gaze landed on her and his smirk widened. He leaned in, whispering something to Hannah, and they both laughed. It sent a sickening rage curling through Emma's stomach. She turned to Henry, lowering her voice. You know who that is? Henry's gaze flicked toward them briefly before returning to her. Daniel Turner. Yes. Emma hesitated before speaking. He is still working at his firm, right? Henry studied her. Is that what you want? Emma's throat tightened. She did not know what she wanted. She only knew she was tired of feeling powerless. Henry set down his glass. I will handle it. The next morning Emma woke to headlines: Daniel Turner under investigation for fraud, accusations of embezzlement circulating. Hannah nowhere to be seen. Emma stared at the news report, her fingers gripping the edge of her phone. Henry had said 4 words: I will handle it, and just like that Daniel's world had crumbled. When she stepped into the dining room, Henry was sipping his coffee as if nothing had happened. You destroyed him, she whispered. He did it to himself, Henry replied casually. I simply made sure the right people paid attention. Emma swallowed hard. You did that for me. Henry set his coffee down and met her gaze. I protect what is mine. Something in his voice sent a shiver down her spine. He was not being romantic. This was not love. Henry did not love her. He owned her. She should have been afraid, but instead she felt something else: satisfaction, because for the first time Daniel was the one who had to pay. Weeks passed. Daniel's downfall spread through the news like wildfire. He lost everything: his job, his reputation, his money. Hannah vanished, leaving him to deal with the mess alone. Emma should have felt triumphant, but something gnawed at her: the realization that she had not just destroyed Daniel, Henry had done it for her, and that meant she had given him power over her choices. She needed to shift the balance. Emma started attending Henry's business meetings not as an observer but as a participant. She asked questions. She learned the names of his associates. She studied contracts. She watched how Henry negotiated, how he manipulated without ever raising his voice. At first he seemed amused by her curiosity, then intrigued. Then one evening after a particularly tense meeting he leaned back in his chair and said, "You are smarter than I expected." Emma met his gaze. "And you underestimated me." Henry's lips curled slightly. "Perhaps." It was a test, she realized. He wanted to see how far she would push, how much she was willing to learn, so she pushed further. She asked about deals, contracts. She made subtle suggestions. And Henry listened. One night over dinner he handed her a folder. "What is this?" she asked. "Your first deal," he replied. "Consider it practice." Emma opened the folder, scanning the details. It was a minor acquisition, nothing high stakes, but the fact that Henry was letting her handle it meant one thing. She was no longer just his wife, she was becoming his equal. The thought sent a thrill through her. Months passed and Emma's influence in Henry's business grew. She learned how to negotiate, how to manipulate without making enemies. She learned how to make people underestimate her, how to wield power without ever raising her voice. One evening she sat across from Henry as he reviewed a contract. She had just secured a deal on his behalf, and for the first time since their marriage she saw something new in his eyes: respect. "You enjoy this?" he observed. Emma held his gaze. "I enjoy being in control." Henry studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Good." There was no affection in his voice, no warmth, just approval. But for Emma that was enough. She had entered this marriage broken, lost, in need of security. Now she was something else entirely. She was no longer just Henry's wife, she was a force to be reckoned with. And she would never be powerless again. Emma had gained everything she once thought was impossible. She was no longer just a woman in Henry's shadow. She had influence, power, and most importantly, control. But power was a delicate thing. It had to be protected, nurtured, and wielded with precision. She knew Henry was watching her closely, assessing just how far she was willing to go. It started subtly. Henry began including her in discussions he once dismissed her from. His associates, men who had barely acknowledged her presence before, now spoke to her directly. Some out of obligation, others out of genuine curiosity. The shift was slow but undeniable. One evening Henry invited her to a high-stakes negotiation with a tech mogul whose company was on the verge of bankruptcy. Emma listened, absorbing every detail. When the time came to make a final offer, she leaned forward and with perfect poise made a counteroffer that undercut Henry's proposed deal yet secured them greater long-term control. The room went silent. Henry studied her for a long moment before a slow smile crossed his face. He murmured that it was interesting and said that she saw what he was doing and did it better. The deal was finalized on Emma's terms. It was her first true victory. But Henry's approval was not enough. She needed more. She needed to prove to herself that she could survive without him. So she started preparing for the inevitable. Emma made quiet alliances, connected with Henry's competitors, and positioned herself strategically. She ensured that if the time ever came for her to leave, she would not be walking away empty-handed. Henry of course noticed. One evening as they sat in their study he told her that she was building something. Emma did not flinch and asked if she should not. He set his glass down and regarded her with an unreadable expression. He admitted that she surprised him. She simply met his gaze and replied that it was good. He chuckled, shaking his head, but he was not angry. Not yet. A week later he tested her in a way she had not expected. She walked into a boardroom expecting to finalize a deal only to find Henry sitting at the head of the table, watching as the contract she had spent weeks preparing was shredded in front of her. He told her smoothly that she was getting ahead of herself and said it was a reminder that this was still his game. Emma felt white-hot fury rise in her chest, but she did not let it show. Instead, she smiled and thanked him for the reminder. She walked out without another word. That night she made a decision. She had spent too much time playing Henry's game. It was time to play her own. She called her lawyer. It was time to take everything she had learned and build something for herself. Something Henry could not control. And this time when she made her move, she would not just be stepping out of his shadow. She would be stepping onto his throne.